How are you feeling about Christmas? Excited? Nervous? Sad? Worried? Broke? Let's talk about on this episode of Journey at Home. Thanks so much for connecting with us, by the way. Our mission is to create content that makes it simple for you to follow Jesus. So make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Keep up with everything we're creating for you right here. Now, here's the thing about this time of year. Christmas has a way of creating strong emotions in all of us, doesn't it? For some of you, you probably got this building sense of excitement because you love Christmas. Your immediate family's in a great place relationally, so it makes Christmas a great season for you. For others of you, Christmas may create sadness, may create grief. Maybe it's your first Christmas since losing someone you loved. Maybe it's your first Christmas since the divorce. Or maybe you're in a family situation that's just difficult and strained. And everybody won't get in the same room to celebrate Christmas together. So you have to try to orchestrate and navigate through competing schedules or even worse, some personal conflicts. And if I was having coffee with you and I asked why things were the way they were, you would tell me a story that probably falls into one or more of these three categories. You would describe some problems you can't solve, or people you can't control, or expectations you can't meet that are just making Christmas hard. In other words, you can't keep your dad from bringing up the topic that always starts an argument and gets all the other family members upset. Or, since the kids have been married, there's pressure from the in-laws family to do Christmas on their schedule, and they just won't seem to cooperate and work together with you. Or since a divorce, now people are splitting time between mom and dad, or maybe they're not splitting time at all, and they're just choosing mom, or they're just choosing dad and not you, and that's painful. Maybe you talk about how you wish your dad wouldn't bring her this year because it creates a lot of tension, or how you have to work the schedule to make sure this part of the family comes on this day, but they leave by this time because you don't want them to meet up in the driveway with the other side of the family. That never goes well. And no matter how hard you try, maybe you would say somebody always gets upset because their expectations aren't being met. No matter how many conversations you have, somebody won't cooperate to make things better. So Christmas, maybe for you, creates a lot of tension. And that doesn't mean there's no joy, but it is more a mix of joy and pain, or joy and disappointment. It's just a reality for you. And my guess is if I ask you why you just don't get everybody together for Christmas this year, and why you just don't make it work, you would be real quick to wave me off and go, it is not that easy. It is complicated. And you're probably right. But could it be that there's something more at play than just the complication of your situation? Could it be that you're avoiding an issue or a situation more so because it's uncomfortable? And maybe you just don't want to deal with it. Because then you'd have to admit those other people, they're not the only problem. You're also a problem you can't solve. You're a person you don't always control, and you can't even meet your own expectations. Well, at Christmas, we celebrate an event that helps with all of that, because it removes all the excuses we make not to move in the direction of what is complicated and uncomfortable. Instead, it gives us a path to navigate through all of those circumstances, even if they're never fully resolved. And imagine how much better Christmas could be if we could learn to do that. So this is episode 2 of our series, Reasons for the Season. And I know you see it this time of year, yard signs, car cleans, social media posts that are reminding us, hey, Jesus is the reason for the season. And listen, the intention behind that is good because we don't want the commercialization of Christmas to cause us to forget Jesus is at the center of Christmas. But the reminder in this series is, according to multiple first century authors who brought us the story of Christmas, it might be more accurate to say that we are the reason for the season. In other words, if it hadn't been for the mess that we had made, there would have been no reason for Christmas. God came to earth in the person of Jesus to rescue us from the consequences of our rebellion. He moved in our direction because we needed saving, and we needed a Savior. That's why we needed Christmas to begin with. For God so loved this messed up world that He showed up for us. And in this series, we are focusing on 3 reasons Jesus chose to show up. Last week, we said Jesus showed up to demonstrate what God is like. He came to remove all the shadows, to clear up all the confusion. He came to illustrate and communicate and demonstrate who God is and who God loves. Jesus actually said, if you want to know what God is like, what He would say, what He would do, what He would value, just look at me. Because if you've seen me, you've seen God. Now, in this episode, we're going to focus on the second reason for the season. And it's a reason of removing our excuses. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. At Christmas, we celebrate the fact that God chose to come near to us. As we said last episode, he moved into our neighborhood. And this idea is front and center from the very beginning of the Christmas story. When Matthew recounts for us how the angel came to Mary and Joseph and told them that Mary was going to be pregnant with Jesus, Matthew summarizes this news by quoting a Jewish prophet from centuries before named Isaiah. Here's what he writes in Matthew 1. He says, all of this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they'll call him Emmanuel, which means, by the way, God with us. So from the very beginning, the angel wanted everybody to know that Jesus would be the walking, breathing, living God in human flesh. God wasn't going to be near us. He was going to be among us, with us, walking right in the middle of us. And if that's the case, then what becomes uncomfortably clear is that very fact removes all of our excuses for us to keep our distance from the complicated and the uncomfortable in our lives. See, if God chose not to keep his distance from us, then we have no excuse to judge, dismiss, or distance ourselves from others whose insecurity, whose dysfunction, whose sin simply makes us uncomfortable. Now, just to be clear, I'm not talking about situations where things would be unsafe or unhealthy for you. But that is not the circumstance for most of us. I'm talking about those situations where we simply avoid things because they're uncomfortable and we disagree with what someone is doing. But Christmas reminds us that God chose to be with us, which means we have no excuse not to be with others. After all, if you think about it, the distance he had to move in our direction is far greater than the distance we'd have to move in theirs. So why is that so hard for us? Well, I think there are a couple reasons. In some cases, we place expectations on people who don't believe like us that are just simply unfair. So stop and think about this for a minute. We get angry at people who don't follow Jesus, whose sins differ from ours, even though those people have never adopted Jesus' values and view of sin to begin with. So how strange is that? Well, we're all riled up and disgusted and pointing our finger, passionately yelling at the TV. These people don't even hold the same values we do. Why would we expect them to behave like we do? And the other reason we do this is even worse, but we got to be honest with ourselves. Sometimes we like to get fired up about other people's behavior and other people's sins because it distracts us from our own. It's way more fun to get riled up about your sin than it is mine. It's way more fun to get fired up about your choices than it is mine. Now, before you push back on this, let me just ask you a question. Have you ever gotten as passionate, as troubled, as disgusted about a sin you committed as you get about other people's? Well, wonder why that is. Jesus told us, actually. He said our problem is we're self-righteous, and the self-righteous are never self-aware. And the reason you know this is always true is because self-righteousness, it actually requires a lack of self-awareness. I cannot be judgmental about your issues if I am fully aware of my own. When I see my sin, well, then I don't think I'm better than you. But if I can remain blind to my own faults, it's easy to look down on yours, to judge you for what you've done. So whenever we find ourselves judging others, it ought to tip us off that we have lost a measure of self-awareness. On the other hand, the more aware I am of the things God still needs to change in me, the more aware I am of my arrogance or my pride or my lust or my insecurity, my prejudice, my anger, my dysfunction, my sin, the more aware I am of all those things God has not yet changed in me, the less judgmental I should be with what God has yet to change in you. And that's because love changes how you see you and how you see all the people around you. So the birth and the life and then the death and resurrection of Jesus should make us painfully aware that we are all in equal need of grace and mercy and love. Christmas should remove every excuse we have to move towards the uncomfortable because Jesus moved through the uncomfortable to reach us. You remember Jesus' friend John that we talked about last episode? Listen, John endured a lot. He lived with Jesus for 3 years. He saw everything that happened. John was one that stood at the foot of the cross with his arm around Jesus' mother Mary as she watched her son die, the most painful of deaths. John had lost all hope. He'd given up after that. So if you've ever lost hope or lost faith, well, John's your guy. He knows what that feels like. But John was also the guy whose faith had been resurrected when he saw and then embraced his resurrected friend He was sitting having breakfast with him on a beach one day. And John finally realized that Jesus was not going to be the warrior king they had hoped for. Instead, Jesus had been a light that sparked a movement that would eventually push back the darkness, not just throughout the Roman Empire, but around the world. And so from that point on, John never lost hope again. He held on to hope all the way through Emperor Vespasian's march through Galilee, Titus' siege of Jerusalem. He held on to hope through the execution of his friends, including Peter and Paul. John held on to hope as he cared for Jesus' mother to the end of her life. And in spite of all the pain, all the horror that John witnessed, I want you to listen to the words he still chose to write. He said, God is love. We love because he first loved us. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. So I know this Christmas, we'll all deal with problems we can't solve, people we can't control, expectations we can't meet. But those things are never excuses to withdraw, even when it's complicated or uncomfortable. If we follow Jesus, we are called to love one another even in spite of one another. Because after all, God loved us in spite of us. We're why we have Christmas to begin with. So this Christmas, when that other mess shows up at your door, sits down at your dinner table, makes things uncomfortable for you, just remember you have something in common with them. You're both the reason for the season. And because of that self-awareness you have, you can simply choose to love them. After all, Christmas has taken away all the excuses for you anyway.